Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be talking about Darth Maul, the Shadow Lord series from Disney+. This show, I think, was, as you can tell by the title and the thumbnail, pretty darn good. I would go as far as saying it is some of the best content we've gotten from Disney with Star Wars and its IP outside of like the Andor Rogue One-esque story. And so we're going to break it down. I think there's a lot of positives. I think there are some negatives that hopefully can be built upon for the second season. And so let's break down overall the story. So the story follows Darth Maul after the events of the Clone Wars, only a couple years after. So it's not like we're closer to the fall of the Empire, we're much more closer to the fall of the Republic. And Maul has lost a lot of power since Mandalore. He's lost control over a lot of the crime families, the syndicates, and so he's trying to take a lot of revenge on those operations that he feels betrayed him. And so we have that plotline going on, plus him also wanting to find a new apprentice, being drawn to Devon. So that is basically the premise of Darth Maul's story. And so Darth Maul, as the story goes on, he's trying to get revenge against the crime families for the first 4 episodes. And then spoilers, as the next 6 episodes happen, it's a lot more about escaping the Empire while also trying to turn Devon to the dark side. That is the general story. You also have another subplot with Lawson and his son Riley, and then Two Boots, who is kind of like your law enforcement POV for the first few episodes, and then eventually he becomes somebody that's a fugitive as well. But that story, as we'll talk about a little bit more in the negatives and the mixed, to me is very generic. It kind of follows the idea of you have a cop who's not available for his son a lot of the times, and so it leads to them having this reunification through the story, and them eventually by the end coming together and Lawson having to make a sacrifice for his son. So that's one of the other stories. And then the last story is Devon and then her master in Master Daki. That storyline basically just is like a counterpart to the Maul storyline, where Maul is trying to corrupt Devon to the dark side. Master Daki is like the only thing keeping Devon to the light. And so you see that storyline contradicting each other quite a lot throughout the first season, and we'll talk about it as I break into more of the analysis of certain characters and things I really liked from the first season. So I think right away, the thing that stands out to you with this show is just how amazing animation has come. You know, all the way back in Clone Wars Season 1 to now, this show looks fantastic. Whether it's just purely the way things look, the animation, the way Darth Maul looks in the show, the way fighting is done, the way you have these beautiful landscape shots, everything is amazing to look at. Even if this show does not captivate you with its story, it captivates you with what's being presented on screen, and that's also represented in the cinematography. The way shots are framed in terms of, sometimes you just have these really beautiful shots. Like one that comes to mind is early on in the first 4 episodes when Devon is trying to escape Maul, and you see that Maul, like his head, is in a shadow overtaking Devon. It's some nice, like, foreshadowing as to what this season is going to be about. And there's stuff like that all throughout the season that just are amazing to watch, whether it's during some of the big fights where you have multiple lightsaber wielders fighting each other. They did a very good job with that. I also thought the color was nicely done in this show as well, reflecting, you know, some of Maul's colors, the red and blacks. A lot of times you see a darker color palette for this show, but then there's other times in like moments of hope, or other times when the color palette is allowed to expand, or even when the Empire comes in, you see a lot more of the grayness, the taking away of people's cultures and kind of conforming to the Empire. There's a lot of storytelling done visually, whether that be through animation, cinematography, and color, and that was a very strong point of the show. Something that I think this Maul show did better than I'd say almost anything else that Disney has put out, at least for the Star Wars IP. Another thing to add to it, so everything looks beautiful, all that, but it also helps that the sound design and the music really amplify it. You know, using old themes like Duel of Fates, of course, but there's a lot of new music here that effortlessly fits into the Star Wars vibe and what this show is going for. One thing I talk about a lot with music is that music should never be something that, you know, stands out to you unless it's incredible. So for instance, Lord of the Rings to me has the best soundtrack of all time. Star Wars has a really good soundtrack as well, but it's something that it sticks out because it's just like one in a lifetime that great. But most soundtracks, what you're hoping they do is they never stand out. They complement what's happening on screen and they help build the emotion that it wants you to feel. Again, I keep remembering some of the early episodes, especially when Devin is in complete darkness. And they kind of bring back some of the sound design and music of when Maul is fighting Qui-Gon and Qui-Gon is meditating and Maul is like pacing. You have some of that like, I don't even know how you would explain it, but some of that like music that's like that whispering, like chanting, great fit for that scene overall. There's just a lot of that kind of stuff throughout. And I don't mean just music, I mean just sound design in general. Whether it's, say, for instance, Darth Maul in episode 8, after he's kind of been defeated, I guess, by the Inquisitors, and he's struggling. It seems like he might give up, and you're hearing in his head, like Darth Sidious is laughing at him, or you're hearing Savage. The sound design is really great in this show overall, and so I think just from a technical standpoint, just really, really well done. So let's talk about then the actual story, the things happening in the show that are really, really well done. Maul as a character, who is my favorite character in all of Star Wars, they did him about as perfectly as you could, because Maul is always somebody that we can root for because he's so, incredible to watch. He's so interesting and intelligent in the way he does things. He has a very strong characterization, being motivated by revenge and selfishness and power. And those things are very interesting to watch. And the show does a great balance of making Maul be like this likable anti-hero, really villain. And I like that this show never paints Maul as this person that is like a possible hero, or he's just somebody that's very misunderstood. Like, yes, we can understand why Maul does things because of his traumatic past. And episode 8 spends a lot of time on that. But it doesn't change the fact that throughout this season, we see Maul use everyone around him as a pawn to get what he wants. And specifically in this season, it is Devin. Everybody that Maul begins this season with dies. I mean, everybody. His Mandalorian companions, the Zabraks that are with him, everybody dies or deserts him and then dies. So that shows what Maul is like. Maul is a destructive force that teaming up with him only leads to really death. It only leads to people around him suffering. And that's because the motivations that are driving him cause those things and the actions that he takes. And so by the end of the season, after we've seen Maul continuously trying to convert Devin to the dark side, we know the last obstacle is Master Daki. He has to die. We know that to be the case. Devin is not going to change to his side. And so when Maul gets the opportunity to basically sacrifice him in a way that can turn Devin, he doesn't hesitate. He puts over his own self-needs, his own self-wants, over what was maybe right. Helping Daki, who has helped Maul multiple times from dying to Vader, he lets him die. It just tells you what Maul has been scheming. It tells you that Maul, even though it had been building up for the last few episodes, that maybe Maul can redeem himself, teaming up with the Jedi. It was never going to happen. And so that arc, I think, is very powerful for Maul. I think he is easily the best character of this season. And I think the best parts of this show are when they focus on him, when they focus on his development, his schemes. That's when the show is at its heights. When the show kind of takes a back seat to Maul, and Maul is more of a reactive character to some of the other plot lines, that's when I think that he slows down. I think specifically my least favorite episodes of the show was the episode 5 and episode 6 drop, because those episodes Maul basically did nothing for like 1 or 2 episodes, where he's just kind of waiting for Devin to get in trouble, and then he's going to step in when the Inquisitors attack. That to me wasn't that compelling, and I think it starts to run into something we'll talk about more in the negatives. But overall, I think Maul was a very strong part in a show that I had a lot of questions on. Because Disney has a track record of bringing back fan favorite characters like Boba Fett, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and then doing their shows very poorly, a lot of the times for fan service or just so people would buy Disney Plus, I was a bit skeptical. With Darth Maul, the problem you run into is, like the Kenobi show, we know where these characters are going to end up. We know how Maul dies. We know Maul's general story. We don't know all the details, and so that's what this show is filling in. But overall, we understand his story. And so My biggest question was going to be, what could they add to his story? What could they do with his character that would make this show feel like it was needed? And I think that they definitely did a good job with that. So let's talk about then the counterparts to Maul, the Jedi. They, to me, were definitely a great contrast of Maul. And I wish that we would have focused more of the show on the Jedi and Maul and not so much like the Lawson plotline, because those two contradict each other so much that it's so interesting to explore. In a world that is now flipped on its head, the Jedi are outcasts, they are basically fugitives at this point, they are being hunted down by the Inquisitors and Darth Vader. It's very interesting to see the way that, for instance, Master Daki tries to teach Devin. You know, they're living in basically like a sewer part of the city. They're not living well. They're also not being able to eat that well. Devin, what kind of kickstarts her whole plotline with Maul, is the fact that she tries to steal food for them and gets caught. There's a lot of interesting stuff there about who should the Jedi be in this new world. They're being pushed out by society overall, or specifically the Empire. What should they do? You know, they can't necessarily step up to try and protect people or else they'll be killed. It's kind of about self-preservation in a lot of ways. And that's where it gets interesting, because then you have the Sith view of things, where Maul is also about self-preservation, but in an entirely different light. And going back to the Jedi, I think it's so interesting because the Jedi, or in this case, Master Daki, is wrong. The idea that the Empire, and one of the quotes he even has in the show is like, he's seen tyranny fall multiple times, it's just bound to happen, is wrong. Because if everybody had that mindset, then the Empire would have never fallen. It's almost a complete contradiction to what Andor said. And that's not to say like, oh, this is bad writing or anything. It's actually great writing. It just reflects the Jedi Order and a lot of their overconfidence and their willingness to just really just sit on their hands and do nothing while corruption builds, and while they're being used as like a military force. It directly shows why the Jedi fell. And so Devin questioning this is right to do so in a lot of ways. Now, yes, a lot of it is also Maul's manipulation, but it is a contradiction that the idea of, oh, the Jedi should not be part of fighting the Empire. Now, let's be fair. There was no rebellion at this point. The Empire was still in its infancy. It wasn't taking over all these planets and doing all the things that it's going to do that lead to the rebellion later on. But it still contradicts that. It shows that, oh, the Jedi are complicit in just letting this stuff happen in the few that are remaining. Remember, there's not a lot of Jedi left anyway. So to me, that I think is a really interesting arc, because even when you see the Jedi and Maul team up later on in the show, it goes to show you their vast differences. You know, Maul is all about aggressiveness in his attacking, but the Jedi are more about defensiveness. It's so interesting the way that the show constantly has the two on complete polar ends, and is kind of pulling Devin to one side or the other, and who will she pick by the end? And so when you have Master Daki's death, which, let's talk about that for a second. I was somebody that questioned keeping him alive for so long, because when we talk about something in the negative, the one issue you run into with this show, I think, is that you kind of repeat a lot of the same things over and over again past episode 5. Like, you constantly have our group of characters are running from the Inquisitors, or they're running from Vader by the end of the last episode. And you don't have a lot of stakes to it, because none of our characters are ever like dying. None of them are really facing any big issues outside of Maul. Like, Maul has his episode 8 like little arc there. But you run into the issue of like, could we have had more development with Devin and Maul in this season if Daki was to say to die in like episode 6 to one of the Inquisitors, or episode 7 or whatnot? So you start to run into that issue of, it almost feels like Master Daki could have ended and died earlier on in the show, but I understand why you leave it for episode 10, and it also fits where the season is ending versus where we want to start for season 2, which is already in development. Is the idea that Master Daki's death is meant to be that last turning point of Devin going to the dark side. Now, you still could have done this if you did it earlier, but you just don't need to have Devin like instantly going to the dark side. You can just have it to where his death has now left her very susceptible to Maul's manipulation, and throughout the course of the next like 2 or 3 episodes, she gives in to that. But I still think the way they did it is pretty good. I just will talk about some of it in the negative with how the pace of the show went and some of the stakes and some of them, I would say, more minor issues I had with the show. But overall, I think the Jedi plotline was also another favorite. I think two of the three I really enjoyed. One of the plot lines I didn't really enjoy as much. But like I said, a big positive of this show is the overall story. It's having characters that develop throughout a season that have their views changed or, in Maul's case, reinforced. I think the show did a very good job of telling a story. And that's something that simply a lot of the Star Wars movies or shows just have not done. They haven't told a compelling story of our characters and their growth or maybe even their decline, whatever. This show did a very good job of that, and I think overall was very entertaining. Now, getting into some of my negatives, I only had a couple. There wasn't a lot of things that I thought were like, that wasn't so good in this show, but there were a couple. So, firstly, I think the world building wasn't that great in this show. For instance, the planet, I even forget the planet now as of recording this, but you would be very much forgiven for thinking, oh, this is just like Coruscant. Even though, again, Coruscant is ruled by the Empire, they would already have been on the planet. But if you're just like the first two episodes and you're watching the show, even the first shot of the planet that we're on, or the city that we're in, looks exactly like Coruscant. And that just kind of shows you the show does not do a very good job of getting us to understand, okay, why are our characters here? Why are all these crime factions here? What is this planet like? What are the people like? Like, Andor did this concept very, very well. So that when the Empire starts coming in more and they start pressuring down on the people of that planet and trying to take away their customs or whatever they want to do, you feel it. You understand why these people are so upset. You understand the people and wanting to fight back. And it hits so tragically when things happen to them, like what happens in Andor in both season 1 and season 2. Here, you don't really feel that. Like, the first 4 episodes, we don't really build up what this planet is. It's just kind of a setting for our characters to play around in. And so by the time episode 5 comes and you have the Empire coming in, you kind of feel it because of our characters. Like, how is Maul going to react to the Empire? How is Devin and her master or the Lawsons, how are they going to react to the Empire? But you don't feel it as like this overwhelming dread onto the people of that planet, because now they're going to be taken over by the Empire. Everything that Lawson was saying in the first 4 episodes has now happened, but it doesn't really feel like that for the people overall, because they're never really shown to be anything more than just a setting for the show. You don't really feel immersed into that world, in my opinion. So that, to me, was a bit of a negative. I think that you could say, well, this show doesn't have a lot of runtime, but I would also contradict that by saying even episodes in the Clone Wars that are of similar length, they did a better job of this than this show did with 10 episodes. So I wasn't a big fan of that. I think they should have spent a little bit more time on the world building of the actual planet and actually establish, like, what is it? Like, how does this planet function? The people there, what is it? We never really get that. The next one I just didn't really enjoy all that much was the police storyline, and so this is kind of like the Lawson family, more or less. I'll be honest, it was kind of a generic story, which doesn't mean it's necessarily bad, but in terms of when you look at the other stories, the deep themes that are working there, the really entertaining sequences versus, you have a cop that spends all of his time at work, he doesn't have enough time for his son. His son, Riley, is not really a character in this show outside of just, he doesn't get enough time from his father, his mother, all that kind of stuff. He's not much of a character. And so that story, to me, it was fine. I think it had a decent conclusion, or a good conclusion, that Lawson basically gives his life so that his son can get away from the Empire, almost like making amends for all the time lost between the two. And so, yeah, I think that it ends on a solid note. It's just the storyline overall, I think just, I didn't really enjoy it that much. And I think you also look at the character of Two Boots, which I just found to be an incredibly annoying character. The first 4 episodes, which is like the pre-Empire phase of the show, it's just constantly, every other voice line from the character is, we should alert the Empire. things are getting out of control. Let's alert the Empire. And it's supposed to like remind the audience that, oh, okay, there's this overwhelming sense that the Empire is going to come at some point. But I don't know. I just didn't really enjoy the storyline much. It kind of felt like it went in circles sometimes. We have like, I believe it was episode 8, where they have to break Riley out of prison, but it's not really like a breakout. It's more like, oh, Two Boots goes right out the door. And so I didn't find the storyline to be that interesting overall, especially of the main 3. It was by far the weakest. And so, yeah. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the pacing, but also mixed with the stakes. So I think the first 4 episodes, to me, was my favorite set of episodes from the season. And it's because it followed a very interesting arc of each episode would kind of start out with Maul doing some sort of like robbery or attack or setting something up by the end of the episode so that Maul maybe takes out a syndicate leader or he does something else. And so you see Maul and his devious schemes that are very clever, while also mixing that in with the Devon storyline and basically the investigation going on about Maul and them trying to hunt him down before the Empire gets there and before things get out of control. It feels like the story to me was at its best here. Whenever one of the plot lines seemed to be slowing down the pace, it helped because the other plot lines seemed to pick up the weight, so that the pacing felt really good between all the episodes. But as you kind of go into episode 5 and 6, Maul, he kind of starts to fade out for a couple episodes, kind of building back up until the main conflict with the Inquisitors by the end of episode 6. I just feel like the pacing starts to get a little wonky because we start then repeating the same thing over and over again. And don't get me wrong, I still enjoyed the episodes, but they kind of follow a very similar formula. Our characters are running away from law enforcement, but then each episode, it just gets to be larger and larger and larger. So one episode, you'll go from the city police or the planet police tracking down Maul or whatever. And then the next episode, it'll be the Empire, and then with an Inquisitor. And then the next episode, it'll be with a second Inquisitor. And then both those Inquisitors, maybe they failed for an episode, and then you get Darth Vader. So it's just escalation the whole time. But you run into the problem of, okay, here's our main characters. They're in a tight spot again with the Inquisitors, and nothing happens. They get away, or maybe Riley gets captured, but then they get him the next episode. And so it gets a little bit formulaic. And the problem, and what I talked about with Master Daki, and why I think having his death earlier in the season would have helped, it would have given more stakes to some of this stuff. As somebody who has watched the show twice now, I rewatched season 1 up until waiting for the finale last night. And that's kind of what started to wear on me a little bit. I still really love the show, but the one minor complaint I have is how formulaic it became and how things didn't really have any stakes. Outside of, say, like Maul, in his episode 8 arc after his confrontation with the Inquisitors, his character development in that episode is very strong. But overall, up until episode 10, a lot of these confrontations don't have much stakes. They don't have much there outside of the character development side of things, which at times is great. It's what makes those confrontations important, but other times there really isn't anything that comes out of it. And so I think the one problem this show had is, let's think about all the characters. Maul, he's a character that we know exactly what happens to him in Rebels. Darth Vader, well, that one's obvious. Both of the Inquisitors, we know, are not going to die in the show. They're going to die a little bit later on. So your main antagonists for this show, we know that none of them can die. We also know Devon is likely not going to die because, well, she's kind of the main character besides Maul, and we know he's kind of grooming her to be his apprentice at some point. So we know she's not going to die likely, which really leaves 2 main characters, and then maybe Riley if they were going to kill a kid, but not likely, and then I guess 2 Boots. So you have 3 characters technically that you could kill off throughout the season. Daki, Lawson, and 2 Boots. Now they kill off 2 of those, but that doesn't happen until episode 10 because they were saving all the gut punches till the very end of the show. But it leads to a lot of episodes that we're having a lot of encounters that should seem very dangerous, but then on a rewatch, they're just not really dangerous because you know nothing can happen to these characters. Like whenever you see Maul fighting an Inquisitor, well, you know neither one of these characters can die, so it doesn't really matter all that much. What matters about those confrontations is what follows afterwards. So, for instance, on the train attack where Maul is fighting one of the Inquisitors, him, Devin, and Riley get away. It's more about what happens afterwards, the development that happens with those characters in between fights. Or the way that they do the Vader fight is really important to me because we know Vader and Maul can't like kill one another. So their fight is kind of pointless to a degree. You know nothing can happen between the two. But when you introduce the idea of Master Daki still being alive, well, this is a character we know that can die, and his death will have massive repercussions on a character like Devin. So that to me is how they kind of fix it. It's just a lot of the episodes leading up to episode 10 on a rewatch especially feel hollow because the only stakes are for characters that are like no names, are like some of Maul's band, like his Zabraks or some of his Mandalorians. They're not really characters. So when they die, you don't really feel anything. So I think that became a problem as the season went on. But overall, I think they handled it well. I still think the show is really good. I just feel like at some point, especially as you got through maybe episode 5 to 8, the show got a little too formulaic with it, and it kind of started to kill some of the stakes for me personally. But let me know what you guys think about the Darth Maul show. It will be getting a season 2, which I'm glad. It was a fantastic start. I really enjoyed watching it. I have not really been a Star Wars fan since Disney bought the rights to Star Wars, and this show really kind of reinvigorated some of my love of Star Wars. It also helped that Andor was so great. I watched that show and loved it as well. So hopefully this new direction of Star Wars, we just see more of these great products. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. What would you give this season out of 10? I would probably give it a solid 9 out of 10. But thank you guys all for watching, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.